Good morning, good afternoon, and maybe good evening for some cases. Hello and welcome to this second online session of Edinburgh Process for subnational and local governments on the development of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. I am Togo Uchida from ICLE Japan, and I will be chairing this online session with Teru Kisna from Aichi Prefecture on behalf of the Scottish Government and the Edinburgh Process partners. And John Mould from Scottish Government will be acting as moderator. Before we begin, I will ask Teru to give us introduction about the translation that we have for the Japanese participants. Teru?
Hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Teru Kisuna from Aichi Prefecture. I'm very glad to support Togo as a co-chair on behalf of goals today. And just as we did in the session 1, today Aichi is providing a simultaneous translation into Japanese through GoToMeeting. And I like to say to the listener of GoToMeeting, please give your questions through the chat box of GoToMeeting when you have any questions. And I will pick up and bring it in this Zoom session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teru. So, the aim of this session is to update you on the Edinburgh process, including the main outcomes for the consultations on the post-2020 Zero Draft and the Subnational Plan of Action, and highlight how you can contribute to the going forward. We are also delighted to have both Francis Ogwell, co-chair of the OEWG, joining us today. And we also have a video message from Oliver Hewell from the CBD Secretariat to provide insights into CBD process. So now I would like to give the word to John to highlight a few housekeeping issues before we continue. John, please.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm sure you're all familiar with online meetings now, but if you could just make sure that your microphone is muted if you're not speaking. If you wish to raise a question in the question session at the end, please use the raise hand function in the participants box. We will also be having a interactive session where we'll be asking you to use the yes and no voting buttons. They can also be found in the participant list as well at the bottom, as shown on the screen here. And other than that, if you do have any questions as we move through, please use the chat function and we will try to answer them as we go. We will also collect all the questions at the end at the question and answer session and try and run through them all then. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, John. I think when the voting comes, there will be another instruction, so please don't feel too, how do I say, scared about this. And we would like to ask for your contribution to the discussion. So as you are looking at the screen now, the Edinburgh process has been led by Scottish Government with the input and support by the Edinburgh process partners shown here on the screen. These cover the whole of the subnational constituency, including networks such as ICLE, where I am from, Regions 4, European Committee of the Regions, and the group of leading subnational governments goals, as well as Wales and Quebec, the UK government, and also supporting organizations such as Scottish Natural Heritage, the Royal Botanic Gardens Edinburgh, and UNWCMC, the World Conservation Monitoring Centre. Next slide, please. So I would now like to highlight the main topics we will be covering in this session today. Starting here, where we are in both the Edinburgh process and CBD timelines, and how they interact. We also want to discuss how Edinburgh Process participants can be actively involved going forward to ensure that outcomes are fed into the post-2020 process at as many points as possible. We will highlight the initial results of the consultations on the zero draft of the post-2020 framework and the Subnational Plan of Action, including getting your views. The Edinburgh Declaration consultation is actually finally open. Thanks you all for your patience on this. And we will also highlight how you can comment on this declaration itself. And finally, we will outline the next steps for the Edinburgh process as we move forward towards COP15. Next slide, please. From next slide, I will pass the microphone to John to explain about the Edinburgh process timeline. John, please.
Yes, thank you, Togo. So those of you who attended the first session will be familiar with the timeline that we showed on screen here, but we've just highlighted some of the current and upcoming actions as well. We've now completed the consultations on the zero draft and the plan of action. We've held the thematic webinars on climate and biodiversity, resource mobilization, monitoring, and nature-based solutions. If you weren't able to attend any of those, they were recorded and are available on our YouTube channel by searching for Subnational Workshop on YouTube or through the Attendify app. The 3 milestones highlighted in yellow are those that we're working on currently. So that's the Edinburgh Declaration consultation, online session 2 today, and the development of the Edinburgh Process supports. As you know, the Edinburgh Process will continue up to COP15, and we've highlighted some of the milestones that will be happening over the next few months in red, such as a webinar we hope to host in the coming months for CBD parties, and we'll be discussing these more as we move through the presentation. It's also important to keep track of the CBD timeline, and I'm sure Francis Ogwald, co-chair of the Open Working Group, will be going through this in a bit more detail, but I just wanted to highlight a few points on here. We now have the provisional dates for the Subset and SBI meetings in 2nd to the 14th of November. There are 2 important points to highlight on this slide before we move on. Firstly, that we're now in the stage of the process that we need to provide input through parties, and secondly, that there's also now a peer review process on the monitoring framework undergoing, but I won't say much more about that because I think we would like to invite Francis to talk about that in a little bit more detail now.
Okay, thank you so much. So can we have Francis to take over and explain your slides, please?
Yeah, thank you. How many minutes do I have?
I think we can allow you to have as many as you need to explain it, Francis. We're glad to have you with us this morning, so please go ahead.
All right. So due to time difference, my co-chair Azil could not be with us, but is with us in spirit. So I will make this presentation on behalf of the 2 co-chairs. Could you please go to the next slide? So in terms of the way I'm going to present is first to look at or to give you an update on the post-2020 timeline and the next steps. And then also briefly talk about the updated goals, the new milestones and targets, and then the implementation, the post-2020 transformative change. So, of course, we are going to touch a little bit on subnational government on this matter. We could go to the next one. So this timeline, I think, was already somehow touched by the previous speaker, but again, it has kept, being modified and redone every now and then. And this is just because of the situation we all know now globally, that is COVID. So it is making it very, very difficult to stick onto timelines or to dates. But nevertheless, we keep trying to come up with some provisional timelines. So as you could have heard, right now, we have completed a table which has the 2050 goals, the 2030 milestones, the 2030 targets, the monitoring elements, indicators, as well as baseline data when or what are the probable time that we think when you are talking about a target or a goal, what is the probable time that we could take as the baseline for that particular target. And so these documents now have been uploaded on the website, and the peer review will take place for about a month. It was uploaded around 25th or so of June, and it ran up around 25th of July this year. So I think you can pick interest there and brace yourself, see what is there. And then we are also, after that, we are hoping to have a thematic consultation on sustainable use. Again, due to the current situation, this is planned to now be mainly online. It may be difficult to have a physical meeting. And then after we have done that, we should then be able to prepare a revised SABSTA documents that we are going now to post for the meeting of SABSTA. That could be somewhere in September. And at least 6 weeks or around September, October, there are 6 weeks before the meeting. And we're also hoping again that those documents will include even the sections of E to H of the draft 0, which we have worked on and we have improved on it. That section was mainly lacking text for the moment, but we are now working on it. And then you will have a complete document that has got the goals, the milestones, and the targets as well. But to say here, before I forget that during SABSTA, we are not going to necessarily negotiate the text of the goals or the targets, but rather it is concerning things that are technical and scientific in nature. That is looking at the indicators, looking at the monitoring elements, the baseline, and so forth. But the negotiation of the text of the post-2020 framework is actually the responsibility of the open-ended working group. So we should bear that in mind. But also, somewhere around September, October there, we hope still to have another thematic consultation on synergies. This is referred to as the BEN 2. We should be having that. And then it is planned for now that we should have SABSTA in November, I think early November. But again, as I said earlier, this is still something that could be reviewed again, given what is happening now. You could have been hearing how COVID is proving very unpredictable in most parts of the world. Some countries are closing, opening, then again closing, back to lockdown. So these are challenges of our time now. But also that meeting will take place immediately after SABSTA, we shall have SBI 3. So after 1-0, and our target again is to have this ready in time for the third meeting of the open-ended working group, and that is again 6 weeks before. Again, the dates for this is also looking very unlikely to happen this year now. Probably next year. It's difficult also to say really what that time period would be, but it is now taken to next year. And after the third meeting of the working group, then we should come with a final draft which goes to COP. And again, the date for COP, you could have seen it was perhaps communicated. But this is still going to be kept under review because things are not very, very straightforward as you see currently. So let's go to the next slide. So what is, in terms of the next steps, and perhaps to begin with the SAPSA 24th, which I've been talking about. So this meeting should basically give us recommendation based on the scientific and technical discussion that will happen then when it takes place. But for now, like I said earlier, there's a peer review which is now going on. It is going to go from June 25th up to July 25th. And we already did the first round of webinars. That webinar actually gives stakeholders opportunity to hear from us, for them to maybe also ask some few questions. And the first one we did on 30th proved very useful. It mainly covered, I think, Africa and other regions. We are mainly using the time zones. And so maybe some of you could have already participated. It was, I think I participated from Africa, some from Europe. Generally, those that time from favored. And then we are going to have the next one today. And then there's a third one will take place on 3rd. And then the last one on 7th July. So that is what is going on concurrently with the peer review, just to make sure we can also hear from parties if they have, stakeholders, if they have some questions they would like to know from us, or clarification. Then the pre-session documents, as I said earlier, you will find the updated goals, 2050 goals, the milestones we had during the second meeting of the working group in Rome, that we needed to be working on milestones. And so in the document that you're going to see on the website, there's one that also includes milestones. Now the milestones are mainly under goals. So when you see the goals, you'll see under that, we have tried to come up with the idea of milestones. And the milestone basically is an attempt to try to predict where we want to be in the next 10 years. And then we see whether our proposed action targets are actually going to deliver us to the 2050 goals. So it is for the next 10 years, you will see we made an attempt to see, with regard to a certain target or a certain goal, where do you think we shall be in 10 years' time? So that is what you will find there as milestones. Then the targets are there, the components, the monitoring elements, the indicators and baseline, data availability, all that you're going to find there. But also we had very, very much strongly during the meetings that we have had with the stakeholders since January 2019 to date. People have continued to emphasize the link between GBF, that is the Global Biodiversity Framework, and the SDGs. Because one, that the SDGs are already adopted by governments. So it is perhaps better or a good idea to make sure that we clearly show to governments that actually when we implement biodiversity or this framework, we also will be delivering the SDGs. And we've seen that this is something that could very much help us to market or to sell the framework. So you're going to see among the documents, there's one that definitely gives information on the links or the linkages between the Global Biodiversity Framework and the SDGs. We are talking of targets. How does it link to the targets of the SDGs? We're talking about the indicators, which indicators that it lead. So you find on a target to try to bring all that. We look at a target, which indicator of the SDG does it link to, which target of the SDG does it link to, and so forth. Then the indicators themselves for monitoring progress, and then the annotation of documents that basically explain some concepts that we have used there, the way we are trying to understand them. So those are documents you're going to find on the website as you maybe visit it. Go to the next one, please. Now, in terms of SBI, and again, SBI also is going to have a very critical role on the process because SBI mainly deals with implementation issues. So SBI will provide advice on the means to support and review implementation, including those enabling conditions, responsibility and transparency, implementation support mechanism, outreach, communication. So all this, again, when we have the meeting of the third meeting of the SBI, this issue should come out very, very strongly. And so it will mainly encourage broad discussion on implementation elements of the post-2020 framework, but also, of course, cover things to do with the biosafety and benefit sharing. The other items that will be very important for the post-2020 process, and these are the following agenda items: the one on resource, technical and scientific cooperation. Actually, with the capacity building, I think that these first two, resource mobilization, financial mechanism, capacity building, this in many ways has come as being so much at the heart of implementation, because the current strategic plan, I think there have been issues on these two, to the point that even we're still discussing resource mobilization, we're still discussing capacity building, you know, other than implementing capacity building, you know, action plans, we are still developing them. And so this is why this time around, you'll see that these issues are being now looked at concurrently with the process as it proceeds. Technology transfer, knowledge management and communication, cooperation, mechanism for reporting. These are going to be very, very critical for us as we move forward with the implementation of the framework itself. And then, of course, where reporting is not done properly, then you cannot assess progress. So we need to be doing that better in the post-2020. And that means, of course, we have to have the necessary capacity, because some of the targets might be one that needs capacity at the national level for governments to report effectively. So capacity building is going to be very, very critical, as well as resources for implementation. Then mainstreaming biodiversity. This is something that is so critical, and we hope in the post-2020 that mainstreaming will go an extra mile from what you have done so far. Next slide. So this one, I know most of you could have seen this, but we keep referring to it because it is the journey that we all want to take. But also the other part of the journey, I mean, the end journey, that's where we want to be. That is the 2050, that we want to live in harmony with nature. I think we have realized, we've seen that we cannot be so reckless towards nature and expect to live on this planet for long. So that is the dream by 2050, that all of us on this planet will be living in harmony with nature. I think COVID has shown us for the last few days that actually when pressure is taken off from biodiversity or ecosystem, you see very quick recovery, simply meaning that even where we could take action along those lines and reduce human negative impacts, nature can definitely serve us better. So we've heard during the consultations that we need to develop the goals covering the 3 objectives of the CBD. That is on the conservation, sustainable use, benefit sharing. And so you'll find in the new documents that you're going to find on the CBD website. We've had this during the second meeting of the working group, and we have taken action. You are going to see that. But that if we have those goals properly achieved, or if we can reach those goals, the 3, then you do know that we are going to begin having healthy and resilient ecosystems. We shall be meeting human needs more sustainably, and therefore that dream of living in harmony with nature can happen by 2050. But of course, for you to deliver those goals and the milestones, then we need to be taking certain actions. And that's why broadly we have got our action targets categorized in 3 broad areas: reducing threats to biodiversity, meeting needs of people, tools and solutions that are necessary. But also you'll see outside those 3 that we need to have means of implementation in place. We need good enabling conditions, and then responsibility and transparency should be there by all parties. So if we have all that package in place, then we know that we could be making a good journey towards 2030, 2040, 2050. So let's go to the next slide, please. Now, this is more of what came out from the second meeting of the open-ended working group on targets, on goals and targets. And I may not explain all of them, but I want to try to tell you a few things that we have so far done since we came back from Rome. On the goals, we got very good guidance from stakeholders that we need to be merging the goal A, goal B, goal C. And so that has now been merged, and you'll see that A, B, C, D coming just in one goal, not in separate goals now. Then the other also was on goal D, that we needed to merge all that, again, not to have them in those bits and pieces there. So again, we have merged that, and you're going to see a change there. So those are the kind of progress we have so far done. When you go to tools and solution on your extreme left there, we heard that we needed to merge target 17 and 20, and we've tried to do that. So in a nutshell, what we've done since coming back from Rome, first to say that we've been working since, I think barely did we take even 2 weeks. I think after 1 week or so, we were already back working online, meeting almost every day now to try to really come up with this framework. And so we have taken the guidance that came from the second meeting of the open working group very, very strongly as we move forward, because that is our mandate, to take on what has come from those meetings. So you'll see development along those lines. So those are the areas I wanted you to know that where action has taken place since we left Rome. Next slide, please. So this is it now, the new ones. Because in the previous slide, I was trying to tell you that we have merged some of them and also reorganized here and there. So in terms of goals, you will see that now we are talking of A, which is going to cover ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity. So that is what that goal now covers, goal A. But under that goal A, what you see immediately below it is actually now the milestones. So the milestones under goal A is going to be area, connectivity, and integrity of natural ecosystem increased by at least 5%. That is in brackets still. Of course, as I told you, SABSA will help us to put this right. So that is what I was telling you, that we are thinking by 2030, we should have reached that. So that is the milestone. Then the other milestone that is still under that is that the number of threatened species is reduced by X% and abundance of species increased by again X%. Those percentages should come again during the SABSA meeting. So when you go to goal B, which is on the contribution of nature to people, what are some of the milestones there? That one, we see contribution to nutrition and food security, access to safe drinking water, resilience of natural disasters, for at least a 10 million number of people. Again, those ones will be put. Then nature is valued through green investments, ecosystem service, valuation, financial disclosure mechanism, and so forth. So that is the milestone for goal B. For goal C, you'll see there that we are talking about ABS mechanisms are established in all countries. You know, if you are talking about access and benefit sharing mechanism, or people sharing benefits fairly and equitably, first the mechanisms have to be there. So where there are no mechanisms, then probably a country cannot be talking about having or sharing benefits arising from utilization of biodiversity. So in this case, therefore, either laws or institutional framework and so forth, all those have to be there in the next 10 years. And then concurrently, we are thinking also that the benefits then will be shared by a certain percentage by 2030. Now, when it comes to means of implementation, on the screen, I don't know whether you can see it. It is not so clear to me here. One, the milestone is that by 2022, means to implement up to 2030 is in place. The resources and so forth, capacity building, we should have that. And then by 2030, again, means to implement from 2031 to 2040, something like that. So that is how we are thinking in terms of those milestones. When you go to the other areas where I would like to explain a little bit, it is on target 3, you see they're highlighted in red. So we have included here conservation as well, apart from just recovery. So there's conservation in there under that target. Then when you go to tools and solution, what have we done there? We've tried to reorganize the flow of that those targets. You'll see that 13, the current 13 now, was previously 14. That dealt with mainstreaming in policies, planning, frameworks, regulation, and so forth. So we have now put it as 14, 13, 14 now is the one which was previously 15 on mainstreaming in productive sectors, supply chains. And then the current 15 was actually 18 on sustainable consumption. And then 16 was previously 17. And then 17, the current one on incentive and subsidies was previously 13. 18, the current one was previously 16 on resource mobilization and capacity building. We have done that to try to align ourselves with the flow of the content of the framework itself. You recall that from E to H, that is where the issues on means of implementation and so forth comes in. So we are trying to make sure that the targets more or less speak to the way we are going to organize the framework itself. So I'll not go on all those other targets. Most of them, you can ask me questions if you still have questions to them, but they are there meeting people's needs. You see what is there: use of species, use of spaces, other regulating services. Health has come out very strongly from stakeholders, and I think even the pandemic now has made it much more an issue to look at. So if we could go to the next slide. Now, what then are we thinking going forward? I think as co-chairs, we are saying that probably we cannot have success without successful implementation. In other words, this framework, however good it is going to be in terms of content, in terms of, I don't know, everything about it, however nice it is, however good it is, if it is not implemented, then it is going to be just a framework and maybe another waste of 10 years to come. But I think people don't want to go along those routes, really, given what we are seeing in the world today. So the current economic studies that will help us to address some of these global issues include the following. One, we have one which is being done by UK, and that will inform us well enough about this process itself, because we needed also to look at the economic angle to biodiversity, not just the science only about species disappearing and so forth. Then the WEF, the World Economic Forum, for it is doing a study which is focusing on the impact of biodiversity loss on business and what they can contribute. So business actually will lose more from loss of biodiversity. If you look at most of the business happening in the world, there's a lot that biodiversity contributes to. So the business community needs to know the risks that are there to their businesses with the loss of biodiversity. So that study will help us actually for the business to better appreciate and put more investment perhaps in biodiversity. Then there are other studies which are focusing on sectors. We have one that is looking by McKinsey, which is looking on how agriculture can address climate change challenges. And you know, with agriculture, this is where we cannot run away from, really, because people have to be fed. The population of the world is increasing. the projection is such that by maybe 2050, our population will be close to 10 billion or more than that. So how are we going to meet the demands of such a huge population with the food production, knowing that the space remains the same? It will never increase. The land will remain the same. It will never increase. So what is going to happen? In some parts of the world, it is a question of clearing a new area, clearing forests, clearing wetlands to produce more food. But again, with that comes the challenge of really also trying to still become sustainable in what we are doing. So it is not so easy to achieve those targets as we move forward. Then successful implementation of strategies. As we have said earlier, this needs to happen both at the regional and local level, but perhaps at subnational level, even as I said earlier, that is where the action is. All the actions that we want to implement will actually be at subnational level most of the time. You plan at national level, but you go and take action at subnational level. So integrating issues, including climate change and nature, into whatever we want to do. And then showing, of course, that past example that we have perhaps done well in being very successful in carrying out some of these activities. So we need to be looking at those successful cases and in those countries where they are, in Spain, in Germany, and see how it can spur action in other places. So we need to really be flagging or, call it disseminating and making more cases known where we have been very, very successful. Let's go to the next slide, and perhaps that might be the end of it. So this is just a diagrammatic kind of summary of what I've been talking about, that the convention is there, that is covering nature, that is covering issues on climate change. We have got therefore to think of the scale at which we are going to take this action. Is going to be at a global level, is going to be at subnational level, local level, but there are all those other studies that are going to come in to help us feed into the process. And therefore, we hope that this arrangement can in many ways help us to move towards a much more transformational change that we need to really see these issues of biodiversity taking better action in the next 10 years and beyond. So this is it from me. I think end here, and if there are questions, I would then be able to take. Again, for the COP15, these dates will be communicated, or has been communicated also, but still remains under review until when things will be, of course, well in terms of the pandemic. We've seen cases again coming up in many parts of the world, like I said, I think including China as well. So things are still not very, very clear, but we hope that it will really, become clear, perhaps more clear in the new year. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Francis, for this. This has been extremely informal and full of information, and it's very useful for us to actually consider what we can do following the Edinburgh Process outcomes. I have a very short question before we move on. Can we share this presentation after the session? Would that be okay?
Yes, you can. You can. It is for us, any presentation that you see us making, with the co-chair, definitely we are free to share it out. Don't feel constrained. You can always refer to them.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think we should move on. I think I'll pass on to John again, asking John to explain about the promoting the outcomes of Edinburgh Process, following the explanation from Francis. Up to you, John, please.
Yes, thank you, Jogo, and thank you, Francis. I think I can already see in your presentation that some of the issues that we'll come on to later that have been raised through our consultation are starting to be addressed already, so that's good to see. As we kind of move to the next stage of the Edinburgh process, in terms of consolidating the results from the consultation and feeding them in, which is the emphasis will move to promoting the results. And we'll be doing this in a number of ways. Firstly, we're producing actually 3 Edinburgh process reports for the SUBSTA, SBI and Open-Ended Working Group 3. And these will be tailored to those meetings. So for example, the report for SUBSTA will be focused on the elements on the monitoring framework, SBI more on the implementation, and then Open-Ended Work Group will have the full report. Secondly, we're looking to hold a side event or side events to promote the Edinburgh process at SBI, and including the upgraded plan of action. And to support this, we'll be working with interested state parties over the summer. The Edinburgh process partners will also be advocates from the results to bring those to those meetings, particularly at SUBSTA and SBI. But however, as Edinburgh process participants, there's also actions that you can take to help promote the outcomes of the consultation. And before we come on to exactly what you help, I think I wanted to highlight this slide, which is taken from the consultation we undertook on the zero draft. And I think it's quite interesting. So this is the question we asked was, how had subnational and local governments been engaged in the process so far? And it's quite good to see that of the 80 responses we had, there was quite a few that were directly involved in CBD processes. There was a lot that were involved in subnational networks, but only 14% of those that responded had actually been in contact through their CBD national focal point. And we've found that maybe that's a little bit surprising, because obviously they're the main contact for the negotiations going forward, and will be leading into the CBD meetings. So going forward, what you can do to contribute, obviously you can provide input today that we can take forward on your behalf. But I think the key point is then to highlight the Edinburgh process to your national focal point, and to engage in the development going forward. And for example, we have the example of the peer review for the monitoring framework at the moment. But what I'd like to do is to hand over now to Teru, who's going to talk a little bit more about some tools we're developing to help you, those of you who maybe haven't been talking to your focal point, to engage a bit more.
Thank you, John. It's my pleasure to introduce the communication tool with National Focal Point, which the Advisory Committee on Subnational Government has developed for the Edinburgh Process advocacy. The Advisory Committee is an organization of subnational governments across the world, includes a member of goals. It's now led by Region 4 and the government of Quebec. All of them are the partners of this Edinburgh process. Considering the objectives of the Edinburgh process, getting the attention and the understanding and support of the parties to the CBD is vitally important. So that's why the Advisory Committee created the template of letter to the National Focal Point. You can find it in the document tab of Attendify app at document number 9. It's rather short and designed to be used by any representatives of Edinburgh partners to deliver the output of the Edinburgh process to the parties. if you don't know precise contact to your national focal point, please refer the link in the slide in the website, in the CBD website. We would like everyone to consider the contribution of yourself to the Edinburgh process by establishing a clear line of communication with your national government, which will enlarge and strengthen the outcome, the result of our overall advocacy effort. Additionally, the letter mentions our planned event up to SBI 3 and also COP15, stating our firm intention to create a space in which, together with our national delegations, we can envision a post-2020 global framework that is supportive to local and subnational actions. We hope this tool could facilitate everyone to reach out to your national government and contribute to our common goals by yourself. If you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to respond to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, for this. Just to add on that, this is a draft letter. It's like a format. So depending on your own situation, you can edit the contents. And of course, it's up to you to sign up for this and send it to your national focal point. Nonetheless, as introduced by Teru, the link is there, so please take a look and consider your input in the process. So thank you so much, Teru, and also John and Francis again for introducing us with the timeline and also further information about the progress of the negotiation itself. So let us move on to the next section. So next slide, please. So from next section, we would like to focus on the initial review of the responses to the consultation on the zero draft of the post-2020 framework. We have received a good response given the challenge times we have at the moment for all levels of government, with 80 written responses to the consultation. So congratulations to us, all of us. I think it's a great result, I guess. And we have also included the outcomes of the thematic webinars on nature-based solutions, climate change and biodiversity, monitoring and reporting tools, and resource mobilization into the initial analysis of the results. We will be asking for your feedback in this session, as I know that not all of you have been able to provide a written response to the consultation. To do this, we will be using the yes and no voting buttons you will find at the bottom of the participants list. And John will guide you through this. So I will pass it on to John again. John, please.
Yes, thank you, Togo. What we'd like to do is just to step through some of the main results from the consultation. And to do that, we'll use the main consultation questions. So the first question that we asked people during the consultation was whether they thought that the 2030 mission goals and action targets address the key biodiversity issues for subnational governments. So what we'd like you to do now is to use the yes and no voting buttons, which you'll find in the participants list, and just click on yes or no if you agree or don't agree that the framework addresses the key biodiversity issues for subnational governments, and then we'll show you the outcomes of the results from the consultation. So if you could click on the buttons now, I see some people that are voting already.
For those of you who are not familiar with the system, please scroll down to the bottom where you could see the buttons of people that indicates who is participating for this webinar. And when you click that, you will see a window opening up on the right-hand side with name list. And at the bottom of that, there's a green and red button. And through that, you could actually vote green for yes and red for no. So I still see a lot of people who have not responded yet. Oh yes, it's coming in.
Just waiting for the translation to catch up.
I think so. 日本の参加者がもうちょっとですかね。
Okay, so we're getting quite a few people responding. So far, most people are fairly positive. So we have 22 people that agree that it's sufficient and covers the key issues, and only 3 saying that it doesn't. Well, I think we can highlight the outcomes, and that's I think matches pretty well with what we received through the consultation. That the majority of respondents felt that the key issues were covered. So with 66% saying yes, 33% saying somewhat, and only 1% saying that they didn't cover the key issues. If I can just quickly highlight some of the more detailed points that were raised through the consultation. Respondents highlighted one of the particular messages that came through was the role of subnational and local governments in all sections of the framework needed to be more clearly highlighted, as in many cases they have a unique and essential capacity for the on-the-ground local and regional delivery of the outcomes. And whilst respondents welcomed the whole of government approach that's set out in the zero draft, they felt that vertical integration should be highlighted as a key principle. There was also some calls for a more obvious link to the IPBES assessment outcomes in the framework. And while respondents welcomed biodiversity and climate change links, they felt that there should be a greater focus on nature-based solutions, particularly amidst the development of post-COVID-19 recovery plans. In relation to the goals, some respondents felt that the 2030 goals and 2030 targets added complexity, and in some cases gave slightly different messages. That the goals needed to be smarter and have a stronger link to the monitoring framework. And that the language in Goal D should rather be turned somewhat rather than nature providing benefits to people, so that people can benefit from goods and services provided by nature. Just quickly in relation to a couple of the specific targets, there was some questions raised about the targets needing to be more concise. For example, target 4 on pollution would be clearer if it had sub-targets because it covered a range of different pollutants. There was a slight concern that compared to the previous targets, some of the specific sectors weren't mentioned, and many respondents referenced fisheries in that case. And therefore, perhaps some of the hooks that were needed for political awareness that a framework might be missing when it comes to implementation. In relation to the section on tools and solutions for implementing and mainstreaming, respondents felt that some of the targets lack clarity and there should be a greater focus on ecological outcomes, but I see, Francis, that section's already being redrafted. And of course, target 13 was very welcomed because of the specific links to subnational and local government. So moving on to the next question we asked in the consultation was whether subnational governments thought that the level of ambition was sufficient to deliver the requirements for nature and people at the subnational level. So again, if I just clear that, if I can ask you to vote whether you agree with that. Do you think the level of ambition is sufficient, or do you think we need to push higher? And I'll give everybody a few moments to to give their vote and see what they think, and also for the translation to come through. What I can say while you're thinking about it is that some of the more detailed points on the level of ambition that were highlighted was that there were some specific areas where I thought that ambition could be higher, particularly on the restoration target, as it was more focused on spatial planning rather than on a specific area target. Yes, so some of you have voted so far. We have quite a split at the moment between those that feel it's sufficient and those that aren't. I'll give it a little bit more. Okay, so we have about half the participants have voted, and we're looking at pretty much a 50-50 split between those that say the level of ambition is sufficient and those that would like more ambition in it, which is slightly different from what we received in the consultation. So in the consultation, again, about 2/3 of people thought it was sufficient. Another third, roughly a third, thought it was somewhat efficient, and there was only a small proportion that didn't. So we're a very ambitious group here today. Moving on to the monitoring framework, we also asked for comment on that, and whether we thought it was sufficient for, again, sufficient to allow effective monitoring at the subnational level as well as at the national level. So if I can quickly ask you whether you agree or disagree with that. Obviously, we've had a little bit of introduction on the monitoring framework this morning from Francis and how that's going to be tackled through the SUBSTA meeting. So voting is slowly coming in. Again, it's a very even split. In fact, no, we are at the moment, we have probably 2-to-1 that they would like to see improvements to the monitoring program compared to those that think it's effective. And I think we can, when we look at the results of the consultation coming in, I think that was also the mixed picture that we received back from subnational local governments. Only a third thought that it was the current monitoring framework as it stood, bearing in mind that there's obviously more work to go on at SUBSTA, was sufficient. A third thought it was somewhat efficient, and a third thought that it wasn't sufficient to deliver what was needed. And the key points that we go into a little bit more detail of what was said in the consultation. Respondents welcomed the monitoring framework as an integral part of the overall post-2020 package and as an improvement from last time. Subnational governments highlighted there needed to be a clear role and responsibility regarding those indicators that relate to data that they are best suited to collect and provide through vertical integration and making sure tools are available for all levels. That it was important that enough resources were available to carry out monitoring. That the indicators should be more reflective of the numerical metrics in the goals, and there seemed to be a disconnect, particularly for the goals, between the indicators to monitor them and the goals themselves. It was also important to put in place smart objectives and that are easily transposable to all levels of governance. So, for example, where fixed targets for X million people may work at the national level, they may be more difficult to achieve at the subnational. And there was still a need to develop although we need to have the strong link with Sustainable Development Goal indicators, they may not provide enough to clearly monitor all of the goals, and there's a need for some new indicator development. And also that the CBD should develop a more comprehensive approach to indicator development and data management, and this is particularly to ensure that if we do adopt indicators now, that they can be in place and be monitored right up until 2050, not just for the next 10 years, that it is a long-term system. And a few specific ones was that there should be, there'd be welcome to have elements or indicators on the participation of subnational and local governments, and particularly in mainstreaming and through the adoption of local biodiversity action plans and nature-based solutions. That there should be stronger elements on mainstreaming biodiversity into sectors and policy areas, and that the marine elements of the monitoring framework do not always fit with the proposed targets. So moving on to the last section of the consultation, was on the sections E to F on enabling conditions, outreach, responsibility, and implementing mechanisms. And we again asked if people thought that this was, these sections provided a sufficient framework for subnational contributions to the successful implementation of the framework. So again, we ask you to consider whether you agree that the sections E to F of the zero draft are sufficient, just to supplement what we've got, and take a snap poll today. So if you can vote again, we'll see what your initial views are. I should vote as well. We have a few people voting. Well, we have a slightly different outcome today than we had from the consultation. I think people here obviously are keen to push the framework forward, because we have more people saying that the sections E to F are not sufficient to provide. It's a sort of 2-to-1 vote, whereas in the consultation, I think most people were content that those elements did provide a sufficient framework for implementing the post-2020 framework, with only a small amount saying that it wasn't sufficient. Again, there was a recurring theme, a call for subnational and local governments to be explicitly mentioned in the framework text, but rather than being placed in an enabling condition, actually to be moved to an implementation support mechanism. And it was highlighted that some subnational and local authorities have devolved responsibility, and in Europe, 70% of biodiversity legislation is actually enacted at the subnational and local level. Respondents highlighted that actually there's a strong role of subnational authorities in providing both resources in terms of both people and finance, and that there was also a need for bottom-up financing of biodiversity and conservation. It was also highlighted that political will is perhaps the most important aspect to enable effective actions, and this should be placed more prominently within the framework, and that national planning and reporting should include all stakeholders involved. Excuse me. So those were the 4 main sections we asked. We also asked some supplementary questions on subnational local government involvement in implementing and reporting. And this highlighted one particular issue. Whilst over half respondents had a local biodiversity action plan in place, and a further 35% were planning one, only a third had actually contributed to their national NBSAP, despite another half wanting to provide support. And only a quarter of respondents had contributed to their national report to the CBD, although nearly over 2/3 would like to be involved in that process. So I think this clearly highlights there's a gap between the role and willingness of subnational local governments to participate and then their involvement in the national level, and it also means that there's a resource there that's not being fully utilised. So I think that's the key issues. I'll just hand back to Togo to highlight the key conclusions before we move on.
Thank you, John, for that. It was very interesting to see how the respondents was slightly different from what we have received. Let me just give you a summary of the conclusion as presented or shown on the screen. So the first, there needs to be a greater reference to the role of subnational local government in the whole post-2020 framework and an emphasis on vertical integration. The lack of specific reference to some sectors meant that the political hooks for actions at the subnational local government level may be missing. And John also mentioned that this was particularly highlighted for fisheries sector. Second, the level of ambition is generally sufficient, was the response, but this will depend on the outcomes of the final negotiation. Mm-hmm. So from this, level of ambition needs to be at least maintained as we go forward to COP15. Thirdly, the monitoring framework needs significant improvement and the inclusion of indicators that can be used at all levels. Particular disconnect was highlighted for the goals and their indicators. Number four, subnational and local governments are in many cases uniquely positioned to implement the framework. Example in nature-based solutions going forward, and this needs greater emphasis. And finally, on 5, despite being willing to contribute, the majority of subnational local governments are not directly involved in planning or reporting against CBD commitments. Now, this means that a potential resource is not being fully utilized. And I guess this is the whole purpose of us engaged in this process. So let us move on to the next section on Subnational Plan of Action. Now, this section, I will invite Ingrid, a senior program manager at ICLE, to introduce the slides. So I pass the mic to Ingrid. To you, please.
Thank you very much, Togo. And just to say, it's a great pleasure to be here this morning. It's been a very, very exciting and interesting process. And I think that despite having to move from what was originally going to be an in-person meeting, we've had great success in if you look at the consultation outcomes and results, both from what you've just seen and what I'm about to show you. So it's been really, I think, a very gratifying process. If you can take me to the next slide, please. So one of the documents that you will remember that was part of this consultation process was looking at the plan of action, the current plan of action that is for the period 2011 to 2020. We had done a review of this document, and it also specifically then looks forward to say, well, what is it that this constituency of local and subnational governments is wanting out of the new global biodiversity framework? And it's, to me, listening to the report back from John now, it's really quite amazing to see the correlation in the responses, so that there's a consistency in terms of the respondents' responses. We had 62 responses. This was not quite as much as on the other document, the GBF, but keeping in mind that this is a more technical document, I think it was still good. And I think also what was interesting is the breakdown. If you look at the types of responses, we categorized it. The majority came from the local and subnational government level, but there were quite a few responses also from other sectors, which is interesting because to me it shows the interest and the recognition of the role and contribution of the subnational levels of government. But what was really interesting was the extent to which within particularly the subnational levels of government, there was an understanding, a familiarity of the plan of action, and the fact that many of the respondents indicated that they had been very actively involved in it, and so in other words, it wasn't just that they'd read about it or heard about it, that actually knew about it and they were familiar with the content and had applied it, etc. And I think this is important because what it says also is that the responses to the more technical questions come from a basis of knowledge, and in its sense, it validifies the responses. If you can take me to the next slide. What I want to do now is, in the next 2 slides, is firstly look at the respondents' responses around where they thought we should be moving vis-a-vis the role of local and subnational governments under the new global biodiversity framework. And in the review document as a plan of action, there's a series of principles that were set out, and in the slide you can see them there in that graph. So the one was around the inclusion of the local and subnational governments in the GBF. Then the second one was around resource mobilization. The third one was in relation to mainstreaming. The fourth one was around capacity building. Then the fifth one was specifically around SEPA awareness raising and action initiatives, communication. There was one around monitoring. And finally, the seventh one was around support networks, etc. And that was the sequence in which we had set them out. One of the questions was, we asked respondents whether they thought, firstly, that the sequence was correct, whether everything had been captured, whether there were additional principles, etc., that people wanted. And what was also quite interesting was to see that there was very little variance in terms of the averages, the voting on those principles. They reckoned them all more or less the same, and they were seen as sort of, in a sense, almost equally important. But in terms of the sequencing, it was really interesting to see that there was quite a lot of new sort of thinking coming out in that. And you can see from those arrows, the green arrows indicate where they felt a principle should be moved up, as it were, in the hierarchy or in the priority ranking, and the red arrows were where respondents felt they could be moved back. So, for example, the thing that I felt particularly important and interested to see was that mainstreaming came up, and that and respondents felt that it was more important, for example, than resource mobilization. And this ties in very nicely with the comments or the feedback that we got earlier this morning from the co-chair, Francis Ogwal, around how important and how central mainstreaming is. But again, to see that an issue like resource mobilization is something that is important also for people. And then also, I mean, in a sense, it's really difficult to do justice to all of the inputs and the suggestions and the comments. The way in which we structured this consultation was to give people an opportunity to, in a sense, do a sort of a ranking or voting, and then gave them an opportunity to provide more detailed comments. And we really can't go into the detail of all of that. There were some really good suggestions, additional comments. A lot of the comments made were, in a sense, strengthening the points that had been made in the principles. Something that came out quite strongly was a strong call for more cooperation, better cooperation. Also stronger links to science and academia so that we can have better informed decision making. Another point that was made was about science-based targets, and also linking to climate change, biodiversity and climate change. Again, a theme that came out in some of what Francis Ogwal reported on. As opposed to, as regards to what additional things people felt, what was interesting that many of them felt that we needed to standardize communication, and there needs to be communication strategies at all levels, particularly at the local levels, and then standardization, particularly around monitoring practices. And interesting, quite a number of the respondents felt that one should not exclude something like citizen science, and participation of the lower levels in setting targets. If you can move to the next slide, please. What I want to do now is to give you some feedback on how the respondents felt that the current plan of action had been, in other words, what had worked well in terms of the current plan of action, and where were there areas for improvement. So on the very left-hand side of the slide, you will see that those were the areas that we asked people to respond on. In other words, the level of engagement, coordination, policy tools and guidelines, awareness raising, leveraging partnerships, measurement, monitoring, etc., and then the issue of funding support. So it was interesting to see that while there was recognition that certain things had worked, by and large, people felt that it was very average and that we could have been a whole lot more ambitious in setting a plan of action on the one hand, but on the other hand, that there could have been a whole lot more effort and investment, as it were, into the implementation of the plan of action. They felt that specifically things that had worked well and they recognized was the issue of knowledge sharing and peer exchanges. And I think this is important because particularly in relation to the comment that Francis made at the end of his presentation around examples and where there were best cases and case studies and showing how things had worked. So I think that there are several lessons to be learned also from the plan of action that we would willingly share. And then I think something that was interesting was that several respondents did highlight some best practices, particularly at the local and subnational government levels. Areas for improvement, there were quite a few. I think one of the biggest ones, and it ties in with some of the comments that we, or responses in terms of the GBF, was around greater integration into NBSAPs, into country reporting. Again, the point of strengthening resource access and mobilization at the local government levels and subnational levels. Greater integration of subnational networks and platforms. And what was interesting here was that some of the respondents indicated that there are many platforms out there, but they sometimes get confused as to what the particular function and role of these platforms are, how they relate to each other, what they can get out of them. And I think there's an interesting lesson for us to learn there as well. Something that also was quite strongly emphasized was the need for more inclusivity and flexibility around policies and guidelines at certain national levels, because the situations, the conditions, the contexts are so different. Then also, again, the point about SEPA and awareness raising, the need to be very specific to the local levels. And an interesting one that came out was this question of language barriers. This came out not just in relation to policy and tools and things, but specifically also around how we communicate messages. And then, as I said earlier, something that where there was also a strong feeling of we need to improve is around a more unified and standardized reporting system across all levels of government. So you can see from the responses, both in terms of looking back at what the current plan of action had delivered and had sort of set out to do, as well as what we're wanting to do now going forward. There's a lot of consistency between the report back that John has given and the sort of consultation outcomes on the plan of action review document. And if you can go on to my next slide, I just want to end off with a few, my next two slides with a few, first of all, some general conclusions, and then I'll sort of just set the picture in terms of where we're going to go now. I think what really stood out for us was that clearly the ambition in the current plan of action was not strong enough, and we need to raise the bar. Not just if we want to give effect to the transformative change imperative, but certainly also because local and subnational governments have shown that they are committed, they are already doing things, and they are ready to step it up and go to the next level. The other thing that I think is really important, what came out from the responses, is that there's a very clear mandate for the contribution of local and subnational governments to be taken on actively within the GBF, and a clear mandate for a dedicated and stepped up decision and renewed plan of action, which I think is really important, and it's one of the major contributions of this Edinburgh process. Also, the need for stronger recognition by CBD and the parties of the role that local and subnational governments can play, more inclusivity, more active participation, accepting this level of government as a part of government and not an observer or an add-on. And then, as I said, there were a wealth of some really practical suggestions about how to enhance and strengthen the role. Many of these things were quite operational, and they are worth looking at, certainly in terms of implementation in the various countries. And if you can take me to the last slide, I just want to say that, as I said earlier, you know, in a presentation like this, one cannot do justice to the wealth of inputs that were made and received. So all of these will be captured in a report, and this will form part of the Edinburgh Process report that will be compiled, and those inputs will be submitted. I know John is going to talk about the process going forward further on, so I'm not going to preempt that. But certainly we will take this all into consideration, and we will report it to the SPI. And I finally just want to say thank you very much to the Scottish Government for this opportunity to have such an extensive consultation with the local and subnational government constituency, but also to our partners in compiling the Plan of Action review document, which is the Goals Group, the Regions 4, Advisory Committee on Sustainable National Governments, and the European Commission of Committee of Regions, together with ICLEI. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ingrid, for that. I think we have just below 10 minutes to the end of the session, so I think I'll just move on. The next section is on Edinburgh Declaration. I'll pass on to Matthew Bird from the Scottish Government to introduce. So Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Togo. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks to all of you as participants in this process. We couldn't have done any of this without you, so thank you very much indeed. So the draft Edinburgh Declaration is now finally open for comment until the 24th of July. You can access it via the documents section on the Attendify app. Clearly, we hope to have this available for consultation earlier than now, so we thank you for your patience. After consultation, the Scottish Government and the Edinburgh Process partners will finalise and sign the declaration so that it can be submitted to the CBD. However, it will remain open for signature by subnational and local governments right up to COP15. The declaration should be signed by political representatives of your administration, and we'll let you know the procedure for doing this in due course. We would ask that participants share it as widely as possible and encourage as many subnational local governments to sign up as they can, as this will increase its weight and influence. Our aim is to present the declaration process and all of the elements that we discussed today and the support that we've gathered. Next slide, please. So for those of you who didn't attend session 1, the Edinburgh Declaration is a political declaration that will represent the high-level aims of subnational and local governments for the post-2020 framework. The Scottish Government and our partners have co-developed the draft Edinburgh Declaration for consideration by subnational governments, and we hope for eventual adoption by many of you. The declaration highlights the role of subnational governments, cities and local authorities, along with other stakeholders, as key partners in the implementation of the framework and highlights the key role they play in reducing threats to biodiversity, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing, and developing the right tools and solutions alongside their actions in implementing and mainstreaming biodiversity across all levels, and ensuring that support mechanisms and enabling conditions are in place to deliver upon the final targets. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so I'll hand you back now to Togo, and thank you all for your.
Thank you, Matthew. I understand that the Scottish Government pulled this off in the end, I mean, in a very difficult time. And I'm sure that we will receive a lot of support and comments. And surely we will promote this through our network as well. So congratulations and thank you so much for introducing that. So we will move on to the next section, which is on the next steps in the Edinburgh process. And now we have a pre-recorded video from Oliver from CVD Secretariat. So John, can you please put on Oliver's video, please? Thank you.
Hello to all of you. I'm sorry I cannot participate in this webinar live, but I will be following this discussion. And what I'd like to share with you is some concluding words from the perspective of the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity on this first milestone in the Edinburgh process. We have a very important first concluding process now, which in fact reminds me how different we are from 10 years ago when we were endorsing the plan of action in Nagoya at COP10 with Aichi Prefecture. So a lot of things have changed. We have proven that cities and subnational governments need subnational biodiversity strategies and action plans, and local ones. They need to be coherent with the global biodiversity framework. This has come out of the Edinburgh process. It's also come out of the Edinburgh process that we need a whole of government approach. All levels of governance need to be considered. We have to apply the ecosystem approach across the whole spectrum of spatial management. We also know that subnational government and cities contribute money, contribute scientific information, contribute knowledge, contribute all kind of experience and mandates in the management of biodiversity all the way from the local to the global level. So I think what we need now, and this is where the Edinburgh process will focus from now on, is formatting this first batch of inputs into what needs to become a draft decision for the conference of the parties. So now we need, as the subnational and local governments take ownership of this process, we also need to think, how is this going to relate to the decisions of the national governments and the European Union that negotiate in the convention. So we need the parties now to take ownership of this process in the sense of looking at this from a whole of government perspective. And the same way as the subnational governments reach out, the cities reach out to the parties, we now need the parties to coordinate that so that there's ownership on this draft decision. And possibly one moment where this will be discussed will be when, instead of holding the subsidiary body meeting of scientific and technical advice and the subsidiary body of implementation, which would have been happening now in August and September, instead of those, the Secretariat will be holding a number of web-based updates with the parties and all interested stakeholders. This, the first notification has been coming out. There will be more, but basically we will be bringing this up, and it will be very important for the Edinburgh process partners to also hold a webinar at that time to remind parties and other players how vertical harmonization of policies will be essential. Then we also need to see out of the Edinburgh process towards Conference 15, which now has been fixed more or less for the second half of May 2021 in Kunming. We need to think of the processes leading to that 7th summit in Kunming and beyond. We need to think of new projects and programs like IKI and Una Rivers and others. We need to multiply that. We need many more platforms like this and projects. We need to see subnational local governments in mainstreaming and resource mobilization and restoration and capacity building. Very important, because we need to harmonize policies. This requires a whole new set of capacity building initiatives. But we also need to think of communications, and we need to think of the very process of producing the next strategy and plans, and monitoring and assessing and reporting on them. This needs to happen on a much more integrated way than before. So for now, those are my thoughts. I hope to see lively discussions going on, and I can only thank again not only the government of Scotland for its leadership in taking this process in hand so ably, but all of its partners. And you know, this includes ICLEI and Regions 4, and the EU Committee of the Regions, and the group of leading subnational governments for the Aichi targets, and many more. So thank you.
Thank you for that. It's very nice to have a support from CBD, of course. Before moving on to the next section, we also have participants from Ministry of Environment of Japan, hoping maybe if there's any comment from Ministry of Environment of Japan, may I invite Ms. Yamazaki or Ms. Takehara to intervene at this point? Would you like to unmute yourself?
Thank you for your introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can't show my video. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I am Mari Yamazaki, Deputy Director of Biodiversity Strategy Office at the Ministry of the Environment of Japan. Thank you so much for this opportunity to make some comments on this great session of the Edinburgh Process. The COVID-19 crisis we now face has confronted and wants us to rethink the way human beings deal with nature. We should recognize this crisis as a serious message from our ecosystem, demanding our behavioral change. And after we tame the pandemic, we must transform our economic and social system into a self-resilient, circular, and ecological society that is compatible with conservation of biodiversity and measures against climate change. From this perspective, global cooperation is of course, important, but it is time to reconsider the importance of resource management on a regional scale, and it is necessary to utilize regional resources and strengthen resilience on a local scale. So I firmly convinced that the efforts of subnational governments, cities, and local authorities will become more and more important in implementing post-global biodiversity framework to achieve the 2050 vision, living in harmony with nature, shared in Aichi. And this context, the consultation outcomes that was presented today was very interesting, useful, and informative for me. For example, needs for strengthening NB sub and LB subs, and more the needs for more inclusive process and mainstreaming biodiversity in local scale for a whole of society approach. And Japan emphasized on landscape approaches and NB sub and LB sub on post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So I hope Edinburgh process will develop fruitful outcomes. And thank you for your attention, and I also wish each of you health and success. Thank you.
Thank you, Mari-san. Thank you so much. We always appreciate the support of the Ministry of Environment of Japan on our process for this actual the great issue that we face. And thank you again for that. So let me move on to the slide, if that is possible. John, can I ask you to show the next slide? Yes. So we only have the last 2 slides, and then we will have a very short time. We are over the time already, but for asking for Q&A. So just as a recap, the key outputs of the Edinburgh process is what's shown on the screen right now. So we have mentioned that we are preparing for the Edinburgh process reports, which will be submitted, and these will be tailored to the upcoming meetings of Substar, SBI, and OEWG3. Second, we have input to the CBD process on mainstreaming, capacity building, and resource mobilization. Third, an updated plan of action for subnational and local government that will be submitted to SBI3 and for adaptation at COP15. And finally, there is the Edinburgh Declaration, which we have just discussed. Matthew has introduced. Next slide, please. With this outputs, we are planning to have these following upcoming Edinburgh process actions. First, we aim to hold a webinar in August as part of the CBD series to highlight the results of the consultation. Second, we have applied for side events at SBI. Third, we aim to have webinar prior to the OEWG3 once the first official draft of the post-2020 framework is published, to seek your views and to feedback on progress with the draft decision on the plan of action. Fourth, we will participate in OEWG3. Fifth, we will hold an event in conjunction with COP15 to present the results of the Edinburgh process and to highlight the Edinburgh Declaration. This is the pre-COP 15 webinar. Finally, we will also consider the need for additional webinars, key stages for the process. And finally, we are planning also an event on COP15. So we are about 7 minutes over, but I think we would like to have a very short time to receive any comments from the participants. Would you like to raise hand if you want to give a comment? You could always leave a comment on the chat also. I heard someone.
Hi, Togo. This is Lena from Singapore.
Hi, Lena.
Hi. Hello. Can I just make 2 quick comments?
Please. We are honored.
Okay. The first is that it is obvious that the plan of action needs to be extended. I think because it's the key vehicle, modus operandi for subnationals and cities to actually be better involved, especially with the strengthened approach. So may I suggest that we do a parallel process of encouraging parties to promote the plan of action, and that should be done before COP15. So we should actually be starting this process of encouraging parties to be more aware of the plan of action. And second, there is always a parallel event, which is the Global City Biodiversity Summit. And we should encourage subnational governments and cities to attend, because just like in the UNFCCC meeting, when the cities came in and showed that forget about what the national government is doing, they are not doing anything, we as cities will be there to push forward and forge forward. So that is an excellent platform for subnationals and cities to actually show that we mean what we say, and having a part in this is extremely important. So that's point number 1, very long point, sorry. Second one is that we shouldn't be compartmentalizing. Well, we have no choice but to do it. But for example, like we say, this is resource mobilization. Next thing we say, we should actually mainstream. Now, if we put mainstreaming of biodiversity as number one, once you mainstream, then everybody will put their resources, which means that it will follow along. If your mainstreaming efforts are successful, then it would mean that the other agencies are involved, government agencies, private sectors are involved, people sectors are involved, and therefore you then pull along not only resources will be mobilized without having to search or a separate channel for it, and at the same time you have people actually getting involved, so you also deal with the human resources factor, or we don't have enough. If you mainstream, the universities will come in, the science will come in, the technology will come in, everything will come in. So the key thing is, let's work on mainstreaming and let the others follow. I think I should let the others have a say. Yeah. Thank you.
That is very valuable comment. Thank you so much, Lena-san. I think we also have comments from Professor Kosaka. I think if you want to give a short statement.
Yeah, thank you, Togo-san. Just I would fully support Lena, and science-based indicators are important both for NBSAP and also for this subnational Edinburgh process. That'll be all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I think we will move on to the final.
Just to say, Togo,
yes.
just to answer Lena's question, is that we're already starting to work on getting the support of parties towards the Subnational Plan of Action. We're still in the early stages of that, so we can't announce anything here, but we will continue to be working over the summer and in the lead up to SBI to gather a coalition of state parties that are willing to support that through the process.
Thank you, John. I think, yes, definitely. We also have the draft letter that we ask all of us who are participating here to use as much as possible to contact their national focal points. So I think with all these efforts, joint efforts, I think we could draw much more strong attention on this particular issue. Thank you so much. We are, again, over the time. So John, I think I would pass it on to you to explain about the slide on identify.
This is just to remind everybody, I'm sure some of you have used it already, that if you're, as you remember when you registered, we'll be using Attendify to keep you updated on the process as we now move into the implementation phase. If you have downloaded the mobile phone version, it gives you also access to the kind of social media functions, and we'll use this to keep you updated as we go through the process right up until COP. If you want to access a recording of this session or of any other sessions we've had so far, they are on our YouTube channel, Subnational Workshop, and can also be accessed through Attendify. And we, so I think just a small reminder there.
Thank you so much, John. So this is our final slide. So I would like to use this opportunity to thank all the speakers and contributors to the webinar's participants through this process. And especially thank you to Scottish Government and John, Sue, Matthew, everyone. Thank you so much for your tremendous effort to pull this off. And as we have been discussing, this is not the end, but this is rather a beginning of us making a momentum much stronger. And then contributing from our side, our end, to have a very productive and implementable framework for post-2020. So I have to apologize that I've overrun again, but thank you so much for your contribution. I think it was very informative. So looking forward to having a further engagement with all of you leading up to the COP15. And please stay safe also. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.
Thanks.
Thank you for
Bye-bye,
sharing.
everybody.
Thank you for sharing,
Thank you very
Togo.
much.
Thank you, John.
Bye.
Thank you, Togo. Yeah, thank you, Tru.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Francis.
Yes,
Thank you
yes,
too.
Francis.
Welcome.
You again, yeah. Okay. See you.
Bye.